Most empires were held together not only by soldiers and steel, but by a quiet plant that looked too ordinary to matter. Without it, ships could not sail, cargo could not cross oceans, and naval wars could not be fought. Governments issued orders forcing farmers to grow it. Inspectors measured its fiber. Poor quality could mean fines, debt, or suspicion of sabotage. A field far inland could decide whether a fleet survived a storm. You might never see the sea, yet the strength of your harvest could determine the fate of ships and trade routes. Then, within a few generations, the same plant was reclassified as dangerous, restricted, and pushed out of industry, medicine, and daily life. No grand announcement, no single turning point, just paperwork, regulation, and silence, until one of the most strategically important materials in history became something most people barely understood at all. He woke before the sun, not out of virtue and not out of habit alone, but because the village had learned to treat morning as a narrow window in which a man could still feel ahead of the day rather than beneath it. The house was dark, the kind of darkness that did not frighten anyone anymore, only instructed them to move carefully. The floorboards held the memory of his weight from thousands of mornings, and the air held the familiar mixture of smoke that never fully left the hearth. Damp wool hung too close to warmth, and linen washed and reused until it became soft in a way that was less comfort than surrender. He dressed quietly, without counting the steps, because counting belonged to another world. One made of paper, seals, and measures, and he had already been pulled into that world whether he liked it or not. Outside, the yard was pale with mist, grass wet enough to darken leather, the fence line dissolving into the gray, the barn's roof a heavy shape against a sky still undecided. Somewhere a rooster tested its voice and fell silent again, as if even the birds were careful about what they announced. His field lay exactly where it always had, and yet it no longer felt like a simple extension of his hands. It had become a number in someone else's book. The order had arrived weeks earlier with a messenger who did not sit down, who did not accept bread or water, who stood with his coat buttoned as though the cold itself was part of his authority. The paper was creased and damp from travel, the ink dark and confident, the language polite in a way that made refusal unthinkable. It named the crop, industrial hemp, and it named the quantity, and it named a date by which the fiber must be delivered, and it described inspection as calmly as if inspection were a natural stage of growth, like flowering or harvest. It did not mention rain, and it did not mention pests, and it did not mention the brittle weakness of a spring that could turn cold again without warning. It spoke instead of national need, of shipyards and rope walks, of strength and uniformity. It offered payment like a courtesy and penalties like an afterthought. He had signed where the messenger indicated, because the act of signing had become a kind of quiet confession, that his name could be taken and placed beside obligations he did not choose, that his life could be entered into a ledger as neatly as grain or timber. In earlier years he had grown hemp as a practical matter, in modest plots, when it made sense and when it fit among other necessities. Hemp had been useful then, not commanding. It had smelled sharp and clean when crushed between fingers, and it had promised rope and cloth in the blunt, dependable way of materials that do not pretend to be more than they are. But now hemp had changed its nature without changing its stem. Now it carried the weight of distant water. He had never seen the sea, yet the sea had entered his season like an invisible creditor. He understood the chain without needing anyone to explain it. Stalks become ret bundles, bundles become fiber, fiber becomes cord, cord becomes rigging. Rigging becomes a ship's ability to hold itself together in wind. The state did not need to stand in his yard with soldiers. It could reach him through this chain, through the simple fact that an empire that moves on water becomes anxious about anything that might weaken the ropes that hold its sails. When he looked at the seed sack, the seeds seemed small and ordinary, but he felt the logic pressed into them. Logic that did not soften for hunger or weather. He began to sow in the way his father had sown, with a steady hand that knew how to scatter evenly, how to keep the density right so the plants would grow tall and crowded rather than thick and coarse. The work was calm, but the calm did not mean ease. It meant discipline. His palm opened and closed, the seed fell into furrows, and the earth accepted it with indifference. Each motion was familiar, but in the background of that familiarity sat a quiet awareness of being measured in advance. He was used to being judged by harvest, by whether the family would eat and whether the landlord would be paid, but this was a different judgment, colder and more precise. The inspectors I had already entered the field months before the first green thread would appear. The inspector would later press fiber between fingers, weigh bales, reject what did not meet the standard, and record the result in an office far away. A shortfall could become a fine. A fine could become debt. Debt could become the slow loss of what little room a family had to breathe. As spring lengthened into early summer, the field rose steadily, a green presence that looked peaceful from a distance. In sunlight, the hemp made a sound that was not quite like grain, sharper and more fibrous, a whisper that seemed to carry its future already inside it. The farmer walked the edges and the rows in the quiet hours, looking for weeds, watching the places where water stood too long, noticing the slight differences in growth where the soil changed beneath the surface. The smell of the plants was clean, slightly resinous when warm, and it clung to his sleeves when he brushed past. In another life, this scent might have meant simple usefulness. Now it meant compliance. It meant the state's expectation taking root. In the village, men spoke about hemp with the same tone they used for taxes. Not anger, not celebration, but a practiced acceptance that sometimes contained a thin thread of fear. They spoke of quotas the way one speaks of whether something larger than individual will. They spoke of a neighbor who had been fined for delivering bales that were too rough, too short, too mixed. They spoke of officials becoming stricter, as if strictness were a season that could grow harsher over time. When the time for cutting came, it did not arrive with drama, only with necessity. The stalks stood tall and crowded, and then they fell in bundles under his blade, and the field changed its texture from living green to cut stems and drying piles. The scent deepened, fresh sap, disturbed soil, the slightly sour note of plant matter beginning its transformation. Retting pits and soaking places near the village carried their own smell, unpleasant only if a man insisted that all change should be fragrant. Here the smell was simply honest. The odor of fiber separating from stem, of usefulness being extracted through time and water. Days became a sequence of handling, lifting, turning, drying. His hands grew rougher. Fibers caught on calluses. Dust clung to sweat. Evenings brought an ache that did not ask for attention, only for rest. And then, when the bales were finally ready, the state arrived in human form. An official came with a manner that was neither cruel nor kind, only certain. He carried papers and weights, and he had the particular cleanliness of a man whose work did not involve soil. He inspected the fiber with fingers that did not bear the same small cuts and embedded dust. He spoke in numbers, in acceptable ranges, in required measures. The farmer stood close enough to smell ink and leather, close enough to see how quickly judgment could be written down. There was no argument in the scene because argument was not part of the process. There was only compliance and the record of it. When the bales were accepted, the relief was quiet. It did not rise into joy because joy would suggest safety, and safety was never guaranteed. When a bale was examined longer than the others, his stomach tightened in the small, familiar way of a man who knows how much depends on the turn of someone else's attention. The cart eventually left the yard, loaded with what had once been his field. Wheels creaked. A horse snorted. Dust rose behind them like a thin veil. He watched without waving. There was no pride in seeing it go, only the sense of a season being taken away intact. Somewhere beyond hills and roads, these bales would become rope and canvas, and those would become part of ships he would never see. In the evening he returned to his table, to bread and small repairs, to his wife's careful economy and the children's quiet noise. The lamp made the world smaller and softer. The talk remained local: weather, chores, what must be mended before winter, because large systems do not belong at the table unless they arrive as hunger or fear. Yet the system was there even in silence, in the knowledge that next season another paper could come, another quota could be set, another measure could be demanded. He lay down at night with the field behind him and the next season waiting beyond sleep, and the thought that settled most deeply was not about ships or empires, but about how easily a man's life could be turned into a supply line. Not by violence, not by spectacle, but by paper that named his land and counted it, by an authority that did not need to shout because it had already made the world depend on what his hands could produce. In the dark, as the house returned to its quiet breathing, the Hemp's future moved invisibly toward the sea, and his own future remained where it always had, rooted in soil, measured by others, endured one season at a time. By the middle of the 19th century, the hemp no longer arrived at the manufactory as a plant that had known soil and weather. It arrived as bales, as fiber already stripped of its origin, already reduced to a material that belonged more to schedules than to seasons. The workers who handled it did not speak of fields. They spoke of shifts, of overseers, of the particular fatigue that settled into the back and never fully left. The workday was long, measured not by daylight but by bells, and the air inside the building was thick with dust that floated constantly, invisible until caught in a shaft of light from the high windows. The hemp passed through machines that pulled and twisted with steady insistence, and the men and women who stood beside those machines learned to move in time with them, neither too slow nor too fast, because either mistake could cost fingers, wages, or employment altogether. Within this world of regulated motion, the body was expected to remain reliable. That expectation grew stronger as factories became larger and more tightly managed. Any deviation from steadiness was noted. Any lapse of attention was treated as a threat not only to output but to order. It was in this atmosphere that the quiet, unofficial practices of workers existed, never openly acknowledged, never discussed loudly, but present all the same. Some drank when they could, taking small amounts during breaks or before a shift began, not to celebrate but to soften the edge of exhaustion. Others relied on plant preparations that were still legal, still familiar, still spoken of as remedies rather than transgressions. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of endurance, carried out discreetly, with the same caution used for conserving energy or hiding an injury long enough to finish the day. The management understood this even if it did not name it directly. Factory rules rarely listed substances. They spoke instead of condition. A worker could be cited for being unfit, unsteady, or improperly composed. The language was intentionally vague. It allowed the overseer discretion, and discretion allowed control. A man whose hands moved too slowly, whose eyes failed to track the fiber correctly, whose balance seemed uncertain on the floor that vibrated constantly with machinery, could be singled out without explanation. He might be sent home for the day. His name might be written in a disciplinary ledger. Repetition would lead to dismissal, not with accusation, but with the quiet statement that he was no longer suitable for the work. These records existed, and many survive in fragments. They do not describe intoxication vividly. They do not moralize. They simply mark deviation from the required state of reliability. Removed from shift, observed inattentive, discharged after prior warning. The concern was not what the worker had taken, but what the worker had become in the eyes of the system. Unpredictable. In a factory where machines demanded precise cooperation, unpredictability was intolerable. Hemp, paradoxically, was both the substance being processed and, in some cases, the substance whose informal use was quietly policed. The same material that sustained empires through rope and sail was treated with suspicion when it appeared to soften the worker rather than strengthen the product. Dismissals happened without drama. A man would arrive one morning and be told he was no longer needed. No explanation was required. Employment was not a right. It was a condition that could be withdrawn. Others noticed. Word spread quietly. Caution increased. What had once been tolerated in smaller workshops became unacceptable in larger industrial spaces, where oversight was constant and labor was replaceable. The factory did not punish to correct behavior. It removed what did not conform. Over time, this administrative attitude hardened. The idea that certain substances made a worker unreliable became detached from context. It was no longer about exhaustion or pain or the long hours that bent the body towards small private reliefs. It became about discipline itself. By the early 20th century, this logic would migrate easily into regulation, then into prohibition, carrying with it the factory's original concern. Not morality, but control, predictability, and efficiency. For the workers, there was no theory behind it. There was only the knowledge that certain practices had become dangerous not because they harmed the body, but because they endangered employment. Survival required invisibility. What could not be seen could not be recorded. What could not be recorded could not be punished. And so the factory floor remained outwardly orderly. The hemp continued to move through machines. The ropes continued to be made. Ships continued to sail. And beneath that order, human bodies continued to negotiate fatigue and endurance in whatever quiet ways they could, knowing that the line between being tolerated and being removed was thinner than any fiber passing through their hands. By the time the hemp reached the city offices, it had already lost every trace of the field and the factory floor. It arrived there not as fiber, not as dust, not as strain in the back or dryness in the hands, but as language. It appeared in columns, in tables, in carefully ruled pages where numbers sat in rows and waited to be compared with other numbers. The clerk who handled these pages did not need to know how hemp smelled when cut, or how it resisted the machine before yielding. He did not need to imagine the field or the worker. His task was narrower and therefore more powerful. He translated material into category, movement into compliance, labor into record. The office itself was quiet in a way that felt permanent. High ceilings, tall windows dulled by years of dust, the slow creak of furniture that had been used too long to complain anymore. The desk bore faint impressions from elbows and ledgers, marks left by bodies that had sat in the same posture year after year, copying, summarizing, confirming. Each morning followed the same sequence. Coat removed, chair aligned, pen tested, ledger opened. The work did not begin with decision. It began with continuation. Papers waited patiently. They did not age the way fields did. They did not suffer the way bodies did. They accumulated. In these records, hemp appeared often but never emotionally. It was listed among strategic materials, grouped with timber, tar, iron. It was tracked by volume, by origin, by destination. Reports from rope walks and shipyards passed across the desk, accompanied by requests, forecasts, warnings of shortage. Naval offices spoke of tension and strength, of wear and replacement cycles, of the cost of failure at sea. The language was technical, restrained, and deeply confident in its own necessity. The clerk absorbed this language and reproduced it faithfully, aware that clarity was not simply a virtue, but a responsibility. An ambiguous phrase could become a misallocation. A misallocation could become delay. Delay could become loss, though that loss would be described later in numbers rather than lives. Alongside these logistical documents appeared another kind of paper, thinner but increasingly frequent. inspection notes, factory reports, disciplinary summaries. They did not describe individuals as people. They described them as conditions, removed from duty, unfit for shift, dismissed after prior notice. The causes were rarely specified. They did not need to be. The system had learned that precision in punishment was less effective than generality. What mattered was not the reason, but the outcome: removal. The clerk copied these phrases into larger summaries, where individual dismissals dissolved into statistics. A number increased, another decreased. The page remained clean. Over time, a pattern emerged that no one announced aloud. Materials that required absolute reliability produced an intolerance for anything that introduced uncertainty. Hemp, essential to ships, demanded workers whose bodies behaved predictably. Anything that interfered with predictability, fatigue, injury, distraction, or informal relief, became suspect. The clerk did not frame this as moral judgment. He framed it as risk management. The word risk appeared more often now, quietly entering sentences where it had not been needed before. Risk to output, risk to safety, risk to reputation. Each use of the word justified another small adjustment in policy, another layer of oversight. Committees met to discuss these matters, though the meetings themselves were unremarkable. Long tables, measured voices, no raised hands. The discussion avoided absolutes. No one spoke of banning materials outright. That would have seemed excessive, even foolish, given hemp's importance. Instead, they spoke of monitoring, of alignment, of the need for clearer distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable uses. The clerk took notes, smoothing language as he wrote, removing any phrase that sounded emotional or speculative. What remained were sentences that could travel safely between offices, carrying authority without friction. Outside the windows, the city changed. Steam replaced sail. Iron began to compete with wood. New materials appeared, promising strength without dependence on crops or weather. These developments entered the office slowly, first as reports, then as projections. Hemp did not disappear, but its position shifted. What had once been irreplaceable began to share space with alternatives. The clerk noticed this not as a revelation, but as a subtle rearrangement of columns. Demand adjusted. Language followed. With this shift came a quiet reclassification. Hemp began to appear in documents that discussed regulation rather than necessity. The tone remained calm, almost gentle. There was no declaration that its time had passed. There was only a growing sense that it required management rather than reliance. The same logic that had removed workers for being unfit now applied to the material itself. It was not condemned. It was contextualized. Its uses were narrowed. Its movement watched more closely. By the time the clerk closed his ledger at the end of the day, he rarely thought about hemp at all. It had become part of the background structure of his work, a familiar term among many others. He washed his hands before leaving, a habit carried over from childhood, though the ink stains were light. He walked home through streets lit by new technologies, passing people whose lives intersected with his work without either side being aware of the connection. At home, he ate, read briefly, slept. Tomorrow the papers would be waiting again, orderly and patient. He did not consider himself powerful. He would have rejected the idea. He followed procedures. He recorded what was presented to him. And yet, through his careful, repeated actions, the world was being adjusted. Not through force, not through drama, but through language that slowly redefined what was acceptable, what was risky, what required control. The hemp continued to grow somewhere. It continued to be worked by hands and machines. Ships still needed rope. But now, between the field and the sea, There was a room like this one, quiet, precise, and endlessly patient, where words were learning how to outlast materials, and where the future of an entire substance could be shaped without anyone ever needing to raise their voice. The change did not announce itself with a date. No notice was posted. No decree was read aloud. It arrived instead the way habits change. First barely perceptible, then impossible to ignore. In the offices where hemp had long been treated as a material of consequence, its name began to appear in slightly different company. Where it had once stood beside timber and iron as a necessity, it now appeared alongside alternatives, annotated with quiet qualifiers. Where available, pending substitution, subject to review, the words were mild, but they carried weight. They suggested that the world was learning how to imagine itself without the certainty that had once seemed permanent. The men who wrote these words were not ideologues. They were administrators, engineers, planners. Their concern was not tradition, but continuity. The sea was still there. Trade still moved across it. War still demanded movement, supply, coordination. But the ships were changing. Steam had altered the logic of distance. Iron hulls altered the demands placed on rigging. What had once been central began to slide, slowly, toward the edges of necessity. Hemp did not disappear from the diagrams, but the diagrams grew more crowded, and attention is a finite resource even in systems that pretend otherwise. In the manufactories, this shift was felt not as theory, but as instruction. Orders changed incrementally. Output was adjusted. Some rope walks shortened their schedules. Some workshops closed sections of floor and left the machines idle for days at a time. Workers noticed first in the way shifts were reassigned, then in the way men were let go without replacement. There were no speeches explaining the transition. The explanation lay in the silence where work had once been. Hemp still moved through the machines, but it no longer felt inevitable. It felt provisional. With this provisional status came a new scrutiny. What had once been tolerated under the banner of necessity was now examined more closely. If hemp was no longer irreplaceable, then those who handled it could be held to stricter expectations. Reliability, already prized, became absolute. Any behavior that suggested unpredictability was treated less as a personal matter and more as a systemic flaw. The disciplinary language hardened further, not in tone, but in frequency. Records filled with small, precise acts of removal. Not punishment, removal. The difference mattered. Punishment implied correction. Removal implied replacement. At the same time, the language surrounding substances changed its posture. What had once been discussed as use became framed as exposure. What had once been a question of endurance became a question of risk. Medical bulletins, cautious and technical, began to circulate through the same offices that once dealt only with logistics. They spoke of attention, coordination, reaction time. They spoke of safety not as a moral concern, but as an operational one. The body was no longer just a unit of labor. It was a potential liability. These documents did not accuse hemp directly. That would have been inconvenient, given its remaining uses. Instead, they spoke in generalities that allowed discretion. Certain preparations, certain effects, certain observed outcomes. The ambiguity was intentional. It allowed policy to shift without confrontation. It allowed practices to be discouraged without being named. In factories and workshops, this translated into an atmosphere where invisibility became essential. What could not be seen could not be recorded. What could not be recorded could not be acted upon. Outside these controlled spaces, the world continued its uneven movement. New materials entered the market, promoted for their uniformity and independence from weather and soil. Synthetic fibers promised consistency. Imported alternatives promised scale. Hemp, once tied to empire through necessity, found itself competing in a language it had never needed to learn. Cost per unit, storage efficiency, predictable yield. These were not categories that favored a crop dependent on seasons and labor. The shift was not hostile. That was its most unsettling quality. No one set out to eliminate hemp. They simply learned how to function without relying on it absolutely. And in doing so, they removed the protection that absolute reliance had once provided. When a thing is indispensable, it is accommodated. When it is optional, it is managed. Management invites regulation. Regulation invites simplification. Simplification eventually invites exclusion. By the time hemp began to appear in documents concerned primarily with oversight rather than supply, the transformation was already complete. It had moved from the center of strategic thinking to its margins, not because it had failed, but because the system had outgrown the need to tolerate its complexities. Fields were unpredictable. Workers were variable. Traditions were inefficient. New systems preferred materials that behaved the same way everywhere. The men who oversaw this transition rarely thought of it as loss. They saw improvement, streamlining, progress. They saw fewer variables, fewer exceptions to account for. They saw systems that could be scaled without reference to individual landscapes or bodies. Hemp, with its history of dependence on human attention and seasonal rhythms, no longer fit comfortably within this vision. And yet, it did not vanish. It lingered, partially useful, partially suspect. Still present, but no longer central. Its identity began to fracture. Industrial material in one column, cultural residue in another, medical curiosity in a third. Each classification carried different rules, different expectations, different tolerances. What unified them was the growing sense that hemp needed to be controlled more than it needed to be produced. For those who worked with it or had once relied on it, this change was experienced not as ideology but as erosion. Fewer hours, more oversight, narrower margins for error. The quiet understanding that what had once justified endurance no longer did. That the same material which had built fleets could now cost a man his job if it appeared in the wrong context, at the wrong time, under the wrong description. The world had not turned against hemp. It had simply moved on. And in doing so, it had taught itself a new lesson. That once a resource loses its strategic necessity, it can be reshaped not by force, but by administration, until what remains is no longer a foundation, but a problem waiting to be solved. The moment when regulation became prohibition did not feel like a rupture to those who lived through it. It felt like a continuation of habits already in place, a tightening of language that had been growing more careful for years. By the early decades of the 20th century, hemp occupied an uncertain position in the administrative imagination. It was no longer indispensable, no longer protected by the urgency of fleets and sales, yet it had not vanished either. It lingered in files and correspondence as a material that required explanation, and explanation in bureaucratic systems is often the first step toward restriction. Committees convened not to debate its history, but to clarify its status. Clarification, they believed, would simplify the work of governance. What they did not articulate was that simplification always demands a narrowing, and narrowing always leaves something outside the frame. In meeting rooms that smelled faintly of paper and polish, officials spoke in tones shaped by caution rather than conviction. They reviewed reports from factories, from medical boards, from port authorities. The reports were not dramatic. They described incidents, inconsistencies, administrative burdens. They noted that certain uses were difficult to monitor, that certain distinctions were hard to maintain in practice. The language avoided moral judgment. It favored practicality. Regulation, it suggested, required constant attention, constant inspection, constant discretion. Prohibition, by contrast, promised clarity. It reduced the number of decisions that had to be made at the local level. It replaced judgment with rule. This was appealing to systems that had grown large enough to feel the strain of nuance. Medical authorities contributed their own perspective, equally restrained. Textbooks were being revised. Pharmacopoeias updated. Substances once included as a matter of tradition were reassessed under new standards that prized isolation, consistency, and measurable effect. Hemp preparations, variable by nature, dependent on source and method, did not adapt easily to this framework. Their effects were described as unreliable, their dosages difficult to standardize. These were not accusations. They were observations made within a professional culture increasingly oriented toward control. What could not be controlled precisely was set aside, not with hostility, but with indifference. As these assessments accumulated, a pattern formed that few questioned openly. Hemp began to be discussed less as a material with specific properties and more as an administrative inconvenience. Crossed too many categories. Industrial in one context, medical in another, cultural in a third. Each crossing required explanation. Each explanation required oversight. Oversight demanded resources, and resources were always limited. In this calculus, prohibition emerged not as an act of condemnation, but as an act of efficiency. It promised to reduce complexity by removing the need to manage distinctions that no longer seemed worth the effort. For those who drafted the policies, the decision felt modest. They believed they were closing a chapter that no longer belonged to the present. They spoke of modernization, of alignment with international standards, of the benefits of uniformity. The fact that hemp had once been a foundation of maritime power seemed irrelevant now, a detail of history rather than a claim on the future. Technologies had changed. Economies had shifted. Materials that once anchored empires could be replaced by others more compatible with the emerging order. The past, they assumed, could be set aside without consequence. The effects of this shift unfolded quietly. Notices were issued. Guidelines revised. Licenses became harder to obtain. Inspections grew stricter. What had once required compliance now required justification. What required justification soon required permission. And what required permission became, in practice, unavailable to most. There were no public ceremonies marking the change. No crowds gathered. No speeches were delivered. Hemp did not vanish overnight. It receded, step by step, into narrower channels, until only a few sanctioned uses remained, and even those were treated with suspicion. In factories and workshops, the consequences were felt indirectly. Lines were repurposed. Equipment was sold or left idle. Workers moved on to other materials, other routines. Few mourned the change openly. Adaptation was a skill learned early in industrial life. What lingered was a vague sense that something familiar had become unacceptable without anyone quite explaining why. The same substance that had once justified long hours and strict discipline now carried a different weight, one that threatened employment rather than sustaining it. The transformation was completed not by force, but by forgetting. As new generations entered offices, clinics, and after prohibition had settled into place, life did not reorganize itself around the absence. It adjusted quietly the way it always had. Systems are skilled at absorbing their own decisions until those decisions become invisible. Hemp did not leave behind an empty space so much as a reshaped one. In warehouses and workshops, other materials took its place without ceremony. New fibers arrived already labeled, already standardized, already accompanied by instructions that assumed compliance rather than negotiation. The men who worked with them learned new textures, new tolerances, new rhythms. What had once required attentiveness to weather and plant was replaced by attention to consistency and supply. The world did not pause to notice the substitution. It rarely does. In offices, the language continued to refine itself. Files once marked regulated were moved to shelves marked restricted, then to those marked archived. The movement was subtle but final. What was archived was no longer debated. It was referenced only when precedent was required, when a justification for the present needed a thin thread of history to lean on. Clerks who encountered these older documents read them without curiosity. The words described a world that no longer demanded explanation. Hemp appeared there as a resolved matter, something that had been dealt with and therefore no longer belonged to active thought. Resolution in bureaucratic culture is a form of silence. In medicine, the change was even quieter. Young physicians trained on updated texts never encountered hemp as a treatment worth discussing. Its absence felt normal to them. They learned a language of compounds, dosages, protocols, all framed by an ideal of precision that left little room for materials that resisted uniformity. Older doctors, those who still remembered earlier practices, rarely spoke of them. Memory that has no institutional support tends to retreat inward. It becomes anecdotal, then personal, then finally unspoken. What could not be prescribed could not be taught. What could not be taught eventually ceased to exist as knowledge. For the workers who had once handled hemp directly, the transition was experienced not as loss, but as erosion. The material disappeared before anyone had time to name what it meant to them. The smell left first, then the dust. Then the machines that had been built specifically for its fiber were dismantled or repurposed. Skills learned through years of repetition became less useful, then irrelevant. Few protested. Protest requires belief that something can be reversed. Most had learned that adaptation was safer. They carried their endurance into other tasks, other factories, other materials. The body remembers how to endure even when the object of endurance changes. In rural areas, the fields changed more slowly. Some land that had once been required for hemp returned to other crops. Some remained unused, waiting for a purpose that did not arrive. The orders stopped coming. The inspections ended. The paper that had once turned land into obligation ceased to arrive. For a time, this felt like relief. Then it felt like uncertainty. State attention, even when burdensome, had been a form of acknowledgement. Its absence left space that was not immediately filled. Farmers adjusted, as they always had, but the adjustment carried a different weight. What had once been demanded was now discouraged. What had once connected the field to distant structures was now a liability best avoided. As years passed, a generation grew up for whom hemp existed only as a word associated with restriction. They learned nothing of its former necessity. In school books, it appeared briefly, if at all, mentioned in lists of controlled substances without explanation of why it had ever mattered. Context was unnecessary. The rule was sufficient. Children absorb rules easily when those rules appear complete. They do not ask what came before unless someone teaches them to. And so the story compressed. A material that had once tied soil to sea, labor to empire, endurance to expansion, became a footnote defined by absence. The systems that had relied on it no longer needed to justify their reliance, and the systems that excluded it no longer felt the need to explain their exclusion. The logic had become circular and therefore stable. Hemp was prohibited because it was prohibited. It was controlled because it required control. Such explanations satisfied administrative need, which is not the same as truth, but often replaces it. Yet nothing truly disappeared. Memory lingered in fragments, in the posture of an older man's hands, shaped long ago by fiber that resisted just enough to teach patience. In the design of old ships preserved in museums, their rigging explained without reference to the fields that once fed it. In documents that no longer circulated, resting in archives where dust softened their edges and time rendered their urgency harmless. These fragments did not cohere into a counter-narrative. They did not challenge the present. They simply existed quietly as evidence that the world had once been arranged differently. History, when it moves without witnesses, leaves behind this kind of residue. Not enough to restore what was lost, but enough to remind the attentive that change does not always come from failure or danger. Sometimes it comes from success that outlives its usefulness. Sometimes it comes from systems learning how to simplify themselves, even at the cost of forgetting why they once needed complexity. And so the world continued, orderly and convinced of its own coherence, carrying forward rules that felt natural precisely because their origins had faded. Hemp remained on the other side of those rules, neither redeemed nor condemned, simply held at a distance by a structure that no longer required it, and no longer remembered the long, patient work through which it had once held the world together. Long after the rules had settled and the paperwork had grown quiet, hemp continued to exist in a peculiar state, not present enough to matter, not absent enough to be forgotten entirely. It survived in practice before it survived in language, held there by people who were not interested in arguments or rehabilitation, but in continuity. In some places it remained as a habit, not spoken of openly, passed along the way certain skills are passed when they no longer belong to formal instruction. An older worker might show a younger one how a particular fiber behaved under strain, without naming it. A farmer might remember how a plant once grew straight and tall, even if he no longer planted it. These memories were not organized. They did not form a movement. They existed as quiet competence, unused but intact. In coastal towns, traces lingered longest. Old ships required maintenance that modern materials could not always provide. Restorations demanded authenticity, even when the original reasons for that authenticity had faded. Rope made from hemp still appeared, sanctioned under narrow exceptions, its production surrounded by careful language and controlled conditions. The men who handled it in these contexts treated it with the same practical seriousness their predecessors always had. To them, it was neither scandal nor symbol. It was simply the correct material for a specific task. Yet even here, its presence felt provisional, watched closely, accompanied by forms and permissions that emphasized how far it had fallen from unquestioned necessity. Elsewhere, hemp persisted in a different way through enforcement. Its name appeared most reliably in legal texts, in lists of prohibited or restricted items, often grouped with substances that shared little with it beyond administrative convenience. The grouping itself reshaped perception. What had once been understood as a material became understood as a category of concern. This shift required no explanation. Categories teach their own logic. Once something is placed among risks, it begins to be seen primarily through that lens. The memory of sails and rope walks had no place there. They belonged to another story, one that had been closed without ceremony. For ordinary people, this meant that hemp entered their awareness only as a boundary, something not to be discussed, something not to be used, something associated with trouble, not utility. The reasons were irrelevant. Rules do not require history to function. They require repetition. Children learn them the same way they learned other limits, without curiosity, because curiosity is shaped by what is permitted to be known. Over time, the association hardened. Hemp was no longer a former resource that had become inconvenient. It was simply a prohibited thing, defined entirely by its restriction. And yet, beneath this clarity, contradictions accumulated. Industries that depended on historical materials quietly relied on exceptions. Medical researchers occasionally encountered old references that did not align with contemporary classifications. Archivists handled documents that spoke calmly of uses no longer imaginable. None of this produced urgency. Systems are capable of holding contradictions indefinitely as long as those contradictions remain compartmentalized. The modern order did not need to reconcile these fragments. It only needed to prevent them from connecting. Those who noticed the gaps were rarely those with power to address them. A retired doctor might recall a preparation once used without incident. A shipwright might know that a certain rope behaved better than its substitutes. A historian might trace the economic logic that had once made hemp indispensable. Each held a piece, but there was no shared space in which those pieces could be assembled without challenging the settled rule. Silence remained the most stable solution. As decades passed, the absence of hemp from everyday life became self-justifying. New materials matured. New practices normalized. The world reorganized itself around what was allowed, and what was allowed shaped what seemed possible. People adapt quickly to such arrangements. They build skills where opportunity exists and forget those that no longer have a place. The forgetting was not enforced. It was simply rewarded. Still, history has a way of preserving pressure beneath smooth surfaces. Economic cycles shifted. Environmental concerns emerged. Systems that had once valued uniformity above all began to reconsider resilience. Materials that depended entirely on industrial supply chains revealed their own vulnerabilities. In these moments, attention sometimes drifted back toward what had been set aside. Not with nostalgia, but with calculation. Hemp reappeared briefly in discussions framed by new priorities: sustainability, durability, diversification. The language was careful, provisional, as if testing whether the old material could be spoken of again without reopening questions the system preferred to leave closed. Nothing changed quickly. Old classifications are difficult to undo because they do not merely describe reality. They organize it. To reconsider hemp meant reconsidering the administrative logic that had once made prohibition feel inevitable. That logic extended far beyond a single substance. It touched on how societies decide what is worth managing and what is simpler to forbid. Such decisions rarely invite reversal. They settle into infrastructure, into training, into habit. And so hemp remained where it had been placed, at the edge of acceptability, present only through exception, memory, or necessity too specific to challenge the general rule. It waited there without agency, as materials do, neither arguing for itself nor disappearing entirely. The world continued to move around it, confident in its arrangements, unaware that what felt stable was often just what had not yet been asked to explain itself again. History in this phase did not move forward or backward. Compressed. Layers accumulated quietly, each one making the previous less visible, less accessible, less relevant to the present sense of itself. What remained was not a clear story of rise and fall, but a condition, a world in which a once central material existed only as an absence shaped by regulation, and in which that absence felt natural precisely because its origins had been absorbed into routine. This was not the end of the story. It was the long middle, where systems rest inside their own certainty, and where change, if it comes, will arrive not as correction, but as reclassification, slow, careful, and almost unrecognizable while it is happening. It did not begin as a reversal, and no one spoke of restoration. The first signs were subtle enough to be mistaken for coincidence, small movements of attention that did not yet form a direction. In academic journals, hemp appeared in footnotes rather than headlines, mentioned cautiously in discussions of historical materials, of forgotten supply chains, of earlier technological choices that had once solved problems now reappearing in different forms. These references did not challenge the existing order. They acknowledged it, working carefully within its boundaries, as if aware that speaking too directly would close the door they were only beginning to test. In laboratories and research institutions, interest emerged not from nostalgia but from comparison. New materials were being evaluated against older ones, not to judge the past, but to understand limits in the present. Uniformity, once celebrated without reservation, revealed its own weaknesses. Dependence on distant production created fragility. Systems optimized for efficiency struggled when efficiency failed. In this environment, hemp resurfaced as a data point rather than a cause. Researchers described its properties in neutral language: tensile strength, durability, renewability. They avoided the cultural weight attached to its name by framing it as biomass, as fiber, as resource. The substance itself had not changed, but the context had begun to shift just enough to allow it back into conversation. These discussions rarely reached the public in a coherent way. They remained dispersed, specialized, insulated by professional vocabulary. This insulation was not accidental. It allowed inquiry to proceed without triggering the reflexes of prohibition that had been built into administrative culture. The goal was not to challenge the rule directly, but to explore its edges, to see where exceptions already existed and how they functioned. Exceptions, after all, are the places where systems quietly admit their own limits. In rural areas, a different kind of memory stirred. Older farmers, long accustomed to adjusting to policy shifts, noticed changes in incentives and language. New programs spoke of crop diversity, of soil health, of sustainable rotation. The words were modern, carefully framed, but they gestured toward practices that were not entirely new. Hemp entered these discussions tentatively, often unnamed at first, described instead through its effects: deep roots, rapid growth, low chemical requirement. Where it appeared openly, it did so under layers of regulation that emphasized control and compliance, reminders that permission was conditional and revocable. Still, for some, this conditional return felt like recognition. Not of injustice, but of continuity interrupted and now partially resumed. Administratively, the system responded as it always had, by managing rather than acknowledging change. New classifications were introduced. Distinctions were refined. Industrial hemp was separated carefully from other forms, defined by thresholds and measurements precise enough to reassure regulators that nothing essential was being undone. This was not a repeal of prohibition so much as an adjustment of its internal logic. The rule remained intact, but its application grew more complex. Complexity returned not as failure, but as necessity. Those tasked with enforcing these distinctions learned new vocabularies, new procedures. They measured plants, recorded data, verified compliance. Their work was methodical, unemotional. To them, hemp was neither redeemed nor suspect. It was regulated. That status carried no moral weight. It simply described a relationship between material and authority. What mattered was not history, but adherence to the present framework. For the broader public, these changes were barely perceptible. Hemp did not re-enter daily life with significance or ceremony. It appeared in products quietly under different names, framed by different stories. Textiles emphasized durability. Building materials emphasized efficiency. Packaging emphasized sustainability. The past was not invoked. There was no need. Modern systems prefer solutions without narratives. Narratives invite questions. Solutions invite adoption. Yet beneath this surface neutrality, something had shifted. The idea that a material could be removed from central importance and later reconsidered without drama challenged the assumption that prohibition was a final state. It suggested instead that rules, like materials, are contingent, shaped by needs that change even when language resists admitting it. This realization did not spread quickly. It did not need to. It existed first as a quiet understanding among those who worked close to the seams of policy and practice, where decisions are implemented rather than announced. For them, hemp's partial return was instructive. It demonstrated how systems remember selectively, how they forget not because information is lost, but because attention moves elsewhere. When attention returns, it does so cautiously, constrained by the structures that replaced memory. Recovery in such systems is never complete. It is negotiated, measured, bounded by the very rules that once enforced absence. And so hemp re-entered the world not as what it had been, but as something newly defined. It carried none of its former authority, none of its unquestioned necessity. It was allowed, but only within narrow corridors, its presence justified by modern priorities rather than historical ones. This was not a return to origin. It was a repositioning. History in this phase did not correct itself. It adjusted again. The long arc that had carried hemp from indispensability to prohibition now bent slightly, not toward restoration, but toward coexistence. The material was no longer central, but it was no longer silent either. It occupied a space shaped by caution, by memory held at a distance, by systems that had learned how to change without admitting they were doing so. And in that space, the story continued, not loudly, not conclusively, but steadily, shaped as always by administration, economics, and the quiet persistence of materials that wait without insisting, ready to be used again when the world finds a reason that fits its present needs. As hemp returned in fragments, it did so without recovering a center. There was no single place where its meaning could gather again, no institution willing to claim it as foundational, no narrative strong enough to pull its scattered uses back into coherence. Instead, it existed across margins, present in technical specifications, sustainability reports, pilot programs, and controlled agricultural trials, yet absent from any shared understanding of why it mattered. This absence of a center was not accidental. It was the result of a long period during which the material had been managed out of necessity, then managed out of concern, and finally managed out of habit. Habits, once established, do not dissolve simply because conditions change. In administrative systems, hemp's reappearance required careful choreography. Every allowance was paired with a disclaimer. Every permit carried conditions precise enough to prevent reinterpretation. Language worked constantly to keep the material contained within its newly assigned role. It was never described as essential. It was never described as strategic. It was described as useful in limited contexts, as appropriate under regulation, as acceptable within defined parameters. These phrases did not merely describe policy. They shaped perception. They trained institutions and individuals alike to see hemp not as something that could anchor systems, but as something that could be accommodated so long as it did not challenge existing arrangements. Industries that adopted it did so quietly, often emphasizing innovation rather than continuity. Hemp-based materials were framed as modern solutions, disconnected from their historical roots. This framing was deliberate. To present hemp as new was to avoid reopening questions about why it had been excluded in the first place. Innovation carries less historical weight than restoration. It suggests progress without accountability. And so hemp entered factories and supply chains under the banner of advancement, stripped of memory, its past reduced to a technical footnote if mentioned at all. For workers, this created a strange inversion. They handled a material that had once justified entire economies without being taught that history. Training manuals described procedures, safety measures, quality standards. They did not describe lineage. The material arrived already normalized, already flattened into function. The hands that touched it learned its behavior, its resistance, its limits, but not its story. This absence did not trouble them. Labor rarely demands context beyond what is necessary to perform the task. Meaning is often a luxury of distance. Yet beneath this smooth surface, the lack of a center created instability of another kind. Without a shared understanding of what hemp was for, its value became entirely contingent on external priorities. When sustainability metrics shifted, interest rose or fell. When supply chains tightened or loosened, hemp's relevance adjusted accordingly. It was never secure. It was always provisional. This provisional status echoed the position of the workers who handled it, employed when conditions aligned, dismissed when they did not. Material and labor mirrored one another, each dependent on frameworks that could change without warning. In public discourse, hemp's image remained fragmented. For some, it was associated with regulation and caution, still carrying the shadow of its prohibited status. For others, it was a promising resource, framed in optimistic terms that avoided specificity. Rarely was it discussed as a historical actor, something that had shaped the structure of societies rather than merely responding to them. History, when inconvenient, is often reduced to background noise. It complicates narratives that prefer clean beginnings. This fragmentation suited the system well. A material without a center is easier to manage, cannot mobilize collective memory, cannot anchor identity, cannot easily become symbolic. Symbols require shared reference points, and hemp had been carefully deprived of those over decades of administrative silence. What remained was a substance that could be activated or deactivated as needed, its presence justified pragmatically, its absence unremarkable. Still, materials carry their own quiet persistence. Hemp did not demand recognition. It continued to perform where allowed, growing quickly, yielding fiber, integrating into processes old and new. Its properties remained unchanged by its altered status. Strength did not weaken because it was regulated. Durability did not fade because it was forgotten. The plant simply did what it had always done when given soil, water, and time. In this way, it embodied a form of continuity that existed outside human categorization. History, watching from a distance, did not intervene. It allowed the fragmentation to continue. It allowed the system to believe that this was resolution rather than suspension. The story, however, had not concluded. It had entered another long phase, one defined not by conflict or disappearance, but by diffusion. Hemp had become everywhere and nowhere at once, present without prominence, allowed without trust, used without remembrance. This was not a failure of memory so much as a decision not to assemble it. And so the material moved forward into the present as something incomplete, carrying within it layers of use, control, exclusion, and cautious return, none of which were allowed to settle into a single meaning. The world continued to use it when convenient, to avoid it when complicated, and to speak of it only within the narrow frames that prevented deeper questions. The center remained empty, and in that emptiness the story waited not for vindication or revival, but for the moment when systems, once again under pressure, might be forced to ask not only what works, but why certain things once worked so completely that they shaped the world itself. What eventually disturbed the calm was not ideology, and not memory, but pressure that could no longer be absorbed quietly. It appeared first in places where systems intersected and no longer aligned cleanly, where supply chains tightened, where materials promised consistency but delivered fragility instead, where efficiency revealed its dependence on conditions it could not fully control. These pressures were not framed as crises. They were framed as challenges, as issues to be managed, as temporary disruptions. Yet they accumulated, and accumulation has a way of altering even the most confident structures. In these moments, administrators and planners began to look backward not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. They examined old solutions with the detachment of people who believed themselves immune to nostalgia. The past, they insisted, was only useful as a reference. Still, reference requires attention, and attention brings with it questions that cannot always be contained. Hemp appeared again in comparative analyses, not as a recommendation but as a benchmark, something against which newer materials were measured. Reports noted its durability, its adaptability, its reliance on local conditions rather than distant infrastructures. These observations were recorded without commentary, as if facts alone could remain neutral. But facts, once assembled, begin to suggest relationships. Those closest to implementation noticed the shift more clearly than those who authorized it. Engineers encountered specifications that quietly included hemp among options previously dismissed. Procurement officers reviewed bids that mentioned it in passing, often framed as a supplement rather than a replacement. Farmers received inquiries that stopped short of commitment, phrased cautiously, testing availability without promising demand. Each interaction was minor, easily dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of cautious curiosity. The system responded predictably by increasing regulation at the edges. Where interest grew, oversight followed. New guidelines were drafted, definitions refined further, thresholds adjusted. The intention was not to reopen the material status, but to ensure that any engagement with it remained fully legible to authority. This was control by accommodation, allowing just enough space for use without surrendering the clarity that prohibition had once provided. Hemp was permitted to exist, but only under constant observation, its legitimacy contingent on continuous compliance. For those working with it, this meant living inside a contradiction. The material was valued for qualities that resisted standardization, yet it was subjected to standards that demanded uniformity. It grew best when allowed to respond to soil and climate, yet it was assessed as though it should behave identically everywhere. The tension was familiar to anyone who had worked within large systems. Solutions were sought not by changing expectations, but by narrowing conditions. Only certain strains, only certain uses, only certain contexts. Complexity was not embraced. It was partitioned. Public understanding remained shallow. Hemp's reappearance did not alter its image decisively. It was neither rehabilitated nor feared. It existed as a technical option, invisible unless one had reason to look closely. This invisibility was functional, prevented debate. It allowed adjustments to proceed without drawing attention to the underlying inconsistency. That a material once excluded for the sake of order was now being reconsidered because order itself was proving insufficient. History, in this phase, exerted pressure without speaking. It did not demand recognition. It simply made itself useful again where usefulness was required. Hemp did not return as a symbol of correction or injustice. It returned as an answer to questions that had been framed without reference to it. This was its quiet strength. Materials do not argue. They perform. When conditions align, performance becomes persuasive. Yet even as this occurred, the system resisted coherence. It allowed hemp back into circulation without allowing its story back into understanding. The separation was deliberate. To acknowledge the full arc, from indispensability to prohibition to cautious return, would require confronting the logic that had governed exclusion in the first place. That logic extended beyond a single substance. It shaped how modern societies simplified themselves, how they chose clarity over resilience, rule over memory. And so the return remained partial. Hemp was used, but not explained. Allowed, but not trusted. Integrated, but never centered. The emptiness at the heart of its story persisted, maintained by structures that preferred fragments to wholes. This state could endure indefinitely. Systems are patient when their authority is not questioned. Still, pressure has a way of changing questions even when answers remain constrained. As the world continued to test the limits of its arrangements, the presence of materials that did not fit neatly became harder to ignore. Each accommodation, each exception, each provisional use accumulated its own quiet weight. The story, once again, did not move toward resolution. It moved toward another threshold. Not a dramatic one, not a public one, but the kind that forms slowly, unnoticed, when enough small adjustments have been made that the old explanation no longer fully accounts for what is happening. At such thresholds, systems often pause, not because they choose to, but because they must decide whether to continue managing contradiction, or to finally allow the scattered fragments of memory to align into something closer to understanding. That decision had not yet been made, but the conditions for it were gathering patiently, in the same quiet way they always had. Hesitation entered the system quietly, without changing its language at first. Procedures continued to function. Forms were still filed. Inspections still occurred. Yet beneath this surface continuity, something had shifted in how decisions were made. Where once exclusion had felt final and self-justifying, it now required maintenance. Officials found themselves explaining rules more often than before, clarifying boundaries that had previously seemed obvious. This need for explanation did not arise because anyone challenged the rules directly, but because reality had begun to press against them from too many angles at once. Hemp was no longer a theoretical problem. It was present again in limited contexts, performing effectively where it was allowed. Performance, when repeated, has a way of weakening arguments that depend on absence. In meetings where policy was reviewed, the tone remained careful, even restrained. No one proposed sweeping changes. Instead, they spoke of alignment, of review cycles, of the importance of consistency across jurisdictions. The vocabulary was familiar, but the emphasis had shifted. Consistency was no longer assumed. It was pursued. This pursuit revealed the strain inherent in managing a material that existed simultaneously as permitted and prohibited, beneficial and suspect. Each new guideline attempted to close gaps, but each closure created new distinctions that required further clarification. Complexity, once removed in the name of order, was returning by necessity. Those tasked with enforcement felt this most acutely. Inspectors, regulators, and local administrators were required to exercise judgment again, even as systems pretended judgment had been replaced by rule. They measured, classified, and reported, aware that small differences in interpretation could carry disproportionate consequences. Hemp plants that met one threshold but approached another occupied a gray space that could not be resolved by numbers alone. The return of discretion unsettled a structure that had been built to minimize it. Where discretion reappears, accountability follows, and accountability invites scrutiny. Outside administrative circles, the effects remained subtle. Most people encountered hemp, if at all, without recognizing it as such. Products emphasized function rather than origin. Labels highlighted sustainability or durability without invoking the material's history. This anonymity was protective. It allowed use without debate. Yet it also meant that the contradictions remained unresolved, circulating quietly beneath daily life. The public did not ask why a material once prohibited could now appear without comment. They accepted what was presented to them, as people usually do when systems speak confidently enough. History, however, was becoming harder to keep contained. Scholars, archivists, and researchers continued to uncover documents that did not fit neatly into the prevailing narrative. Naval records, agricultural reports, industrial logs, all testified to a period when hemp had not been marginal but central. These findings did not circulate widely, but they accumulated within specialized communities. Each discovery reinforced the sense that the present arrangement was not the natural outcome it claimed to be, but the result of choices shaped by particular technological and administrative priorities. This accumulation did not produce confrontation. It produced hesitation. The certainty that had once accompanied prohibition softened into caution. Policymakers became less willing to declare absolutes. Reviews were scheduled, then extended. Pilot programs were launched, then evaluated without clear conclusions. The system began to behave as though it were waiting for data, for consensus, for a moment when change could be framed as inevitable rather than corrective. For those who remembered earlier phases, this hesitation was familiar. They recognized it as the space that opens when a structure has not yet decided how to adapt. It is a quiet space easily mistaken for stability. In truth, it is a holding pattern. Systems linger there when neither continuation nor reversal feels fully defensible. During such periods, materials like hemp gain significance not because they are promoted, but because they reveal the limits of existing logic. The material itself remained indifferent. It continued to grow where permitted, to be processed where allowed, to perform as it always had. It did not demand recognition. It did not insist on rehabilitation. Its persistence lay precisely in this lack of demand. Where systems hesitated, it waited. Where conditions aligned, it worked. This quiet reliability contrasted sharply with the administrative effort required to justify its marginal status. As years passed, the hesitation did not resolve itself. It became a feature rather than a phase. Policies adjusted incrementally. Language softened further. Prohibition remained on paper, but its edges blurred in practice. What had once been forbidden outright was now restricted, contextualized, managed. The difference mattered, though few articulated it clearly. The rule still existed, but its authority had shifted from certainty to maintenance. In this environment, the story of hemp did not move toward triumph or vindication. It moved toward recognition of ambiguity. The world had become more comfortable with partial truths, with solutions that worked well enough without fully aligning with their own explanations. Hemp occupied this space perfectly. It was useful without being celebrated, present without being central, allowed without being trusted. This was not resolution. It was accommodation. And accommodation, when sustained long enough, has a way of preparing the ground for questions that can no longer be postponed. Not because anyone demands answers, but because the system itself begins to feel the cost of continuing without them. Eventually, the hesitation itself became costly. Not in a way that could be traced to a single decision or failure, but in the diffuse manner by which systems begin to sense that they are carrying more tension than they were designed to hold. Policies grew thicker. Definitions multiplied. Each attempt to preserve clarity produced additional clauses, additional exceptions, additional rooms where judgment quietly returned under another name. What had once been simplified by prohibition was now complicated by accommodation, and the effort required to maintain that balance began to show. Administrators noticed it in the length of meetings, in the number of cross-references required to justify routine actions, in the way responsibility drifted rather than settled. The system was still functioning, but it was working harder to explain itself. This was the moment when the question emerged, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. It appeared in internal reviews, in marginal notes, in conversations that ended with silence rather than conclusion. The question was not whether hemp should be allowed or forbidden. That framing felt too blunt, too exposed. The question was quieter and therefore more unsettling. What problem, exactly, had prohibition been solving? For years, the answer had seemed obvious. Control, order, predictability. But predictability had proven fragile. Order had required constant reinforcement. Control had become distributed across so many mechanisms that it no longer felt efficient. The question lingered because the old answers no longer aligned cleanly with present conditions. Those who encountered this question did not rush to address it. They recognized its danger. To answer it honestly would require acknowledging that the prohibition had not been a neutral outcome of evidence alone, but a choice shaped by technological transitions, administrative convenience, and a preference for clarity over continuity. Such acknowledgement would not only affect hemp. It would cast light on other decisions made in the same period under similar pressures, justified by similar language. The system hesitated not because it lacked information, but because it understood the implications of assembling that information into a single narrative. Outside institutional spaces, the world continued its uneven adjustments. Farmers experimented cautiously where permitted. Manufacturers incorporated hemp where it solved problems that alternatives could not. Consumers encountered it without noticing, trusting labels and standards without curiosity. Life adapted faster than policy ever could. This adaptation did not wait for permission to be philosophically complete. It operated on practical need. Where hemp worked, it stayed. Where it complicated matters, it was avoided. These choices were local, uncoordinated, and therefore difficult to govern through centralized logic. History, watching from its long perspective, offered no resolution. It did not insist that the past be restored or that the present be defended. It simply revealed a pattern that had repeated many times before. Materials become indispensable, then inconvenient, then suspect, then forgotten, then quietly useful again. Each phase believes itself to be final. None of them are. What changes is not the material, but the structure of attention surrounding it. The question continued to circulate because it had no single owner. It belonged to no committee, no discipline, no authority willing to claim it. It lived instead in the space between practices and policies, between what people did and what systems said they did. That space had grown wider over time. The return of hemp, partial and controlled, had exposed it further. The system could no longer pretend that its categories fully explained reality. They organized it, certainly. They constrained it. But explanation had begun to slip. In this moment, the story did not turn toward decision. It turned toward recognition. Recognition that prohibition had been less a conclusion than a pause, imposed during a period when the world needed fewer variables, when speed and scale demanded sacrifice of memory. Recognition that the present, facing different pressures, could no longer rely on the same simplifications without cost. Recognition, finally, that materials carry histories whether systems acknowledge them or not, and that those histories resurface whenever usefulness and memory intersect. This recognition did not yet change the rules. It changed something more subtle, the confidence with which the rules were held. What had once felt settled now felt provisional. What had once been defended now required justification. The system had not decided to remember, but it had begun to realize that forgetting was no longer effortless. The question remained unanswered, but it was no longer avoidable. And in systems shaped by habit and continuity, the moment when a question can no longer be avoided is often the true beginning of change, even if that change, when it arrives, will do so quietly, without apology, and without ever naming the long path that led to it. What followed was not reform, but drift, slow, deliberate, almost cautious, as if the system were feeling its way forward without committing to a direction. The question that had emerged did not lead immediately to answers, but it changed the posture of those who encountered it. Decisions were made with slightly more hesitation, statements with slightly more qualification. Where once language had closed doors, it now left them ajar. This was not indecision so much as a recognition that finality had become expensive. To declare an end point required confidence that no longer felt warranted. In this atmosphere, fragments of the past began to align in ways they had not before. Not dramatically, not through revelation, but through proximity. An economic study referencing supply chain resilience would sit beside a historical analysis of maritime materials. An environmental report would echo the conclusions of an old agricultural survey, unknowingly retracing its logic. These texts did not cite one another. They did not need to. Their adjacency alone created resonance. Meaning began to emerge not from argument, but from repetition across contexts that had once been separate. Those who noticed this alignment were rarely those empowered to act decisively. They were analysts, researchers, mid-level administrators, people whose work involved synthesis rather than proclamation. They assembled reports that did not advocate openly, but they adjusted emphasis. They placed certain data points closer together. They chose examples carefully. In doing so, they allowed implications to surface without forcing them into policy. This was a way of working that respected institutional inertia while still acknowledging change. It was quiet work, and it suited the material at the center of it. Hemp, in this phase, was no longer simply a regulated substance or a provisional resource. It became a reference point, a way of thinking about how systems evolve and what they sacrifice along the way. Discussions of resilience began to include questions about diversity of materials. Conversations about sustainability began to include considerations of local production versus global dependence. In these discussions, hemp appeared not as an answer, but as evidence that alternatives had once existed and could exist again under different conditions. This reframing mattered. It shifted the conversation from should we allow this to why did we exclude it so completely in the first place. The system responded, as it often does, by absorbing the reframing without acknowledging it explicitly. Training programs updated their materials. Standards committees revised definitions. Regulatory language grew more nuanced, more layered. None of these changes were presented as corrections. They were presented as updates, refinements, adjustments to current knowledge. The past remained officially settled, but its influence returned indirectly, shaping how the present understood its own flexibility. For workers and producers, this translated into a cautious expansion of possibility. New opportunities appeared, bounded but real. Cultivation was permitted under specific conditions. Processing facilities reopened on a small scale. Skills that had been dormant found application again, though often mediated by modern technologies and oversight. The work was familiar and unfamiliar at once. Hands recognized the material, but the surrounding structures felt different. More watchful, more procedural. Trust had not returned. Permission had. This distinction mattered. Permission can be withdrawn. Trust implies continuity. Still, the reassembly continued. Over time, the presence of hemp in legitimate contexts ceased to feel exceptional. It became part of the background again, though not the foundation it once had been. Its story remained fragmented, but the fragments were closer now, more visible to those inclined to look. The emptiness at the center persisted, but it felt less absolute. There were now paths leading toward it, even if no one had yet chosen to walk them fully. History, at this stage, did not demand acknowledgement. It allowed itself to be inferred. Those who worked within the system could sense that something was changing, even if they could not name it. The confidence that had once supported exclusion had softened into something more provisional, more aware of its own limits. This awareness did not weaken the system. It made it more cautious, more adaptive, less certain of its right to simplify complexity out of existence. The story of hemp, moving through this phase, became less about the material itself and more about the structures that had shaped its fate. It illuminated how decisions made for immediate efficiency could echo for generations, how categories once useful could become constraints, how forgetting could function as policy. These insights did not circulate widely, but they influenced those responsible for designing the future's frameworks. And so the reassembly continued, not toward restoration, but toward understanding. Understanding that prohibition had been a moment, not a truth. Understanding that necessity is contextual, not permanent. Understanding that materials, like the societies that use them, exist within cycles of attention and neglect that rarely align with moral narratives. What had once been framed as resolution now appeared as one phase among many, shaped by pressures that no longer held the same force. This understanding did not resolve the story, but it prepared the ground for whatever would come next, by loosening the certainty that had once insisted there was nothing more to consider. As understanding spread quietly through institutions and practices, the world began to reorganize itself around a different assumption. Not that certainty was achievable, but that it was no longer necessary. This was not a philosophical shift announced in speeches or written into charters. It emerged instead from fatigue. The effort required to maintain absolute positions had grown heavier than the effort required to live with ambiguity. Systems that once prided themselves on clean boundaries discovered that flexibility, though messier, allowed them to respond without constant revision. Hemp existed comfortably within this new condition, not because it had been vindicated, but because it no longer demanded certainty to justify its presence. In practical terms, this meant that hemp stopped being exceptional. It was no longer introduced as a special case or defended as an alternative. It simply appeared where it made sense and disappeared where it did not. Its use was guided less by ideology than by fit. In construction, it was chosen for certain properties. In agriculture, for certain rotations. In manufacturing, for specific tolerances. Each choice was narrow, local, reversible. No single application carried symbolic weight. Together, they formed a quiet network of use that no longer needed to explain itself. Administrators adapted to this condition without acknowledging the transition. Policy documents became less declarative, more procedural. They focused on how to evaluate outcomes rather than how to define categories. This change was subtle but consequential. When outcomes matter more than definitions, materials regain agency, not in the sense of intention, but in the sense that their performance begins to matter again. Hemp's value returned not because it had been argued into legitimacy, but because it functioned reliably within constraints that could now tolerate variance. For those who worked closest to these shifts, the change felt familiar. It resembled earlier periods when practice had quietly outpaced doctrine. They learned to navigate rules without expecting them to be comprehensive. They treated guidelines as frameworks rather than truths. This approach required attentiveness, judgment, and responsibility, qualities that had once been suppressed in favor of uniform compliance. Their return did not signal disorder. It signaled maturity. Systems capable of enduring uncertainty tend to survive longer than those built on rigid clarity. The public, as usual, noticed little. Life rarely pauses to reflect on the administrative logic behind materials. People encountered hemp as part of products, environments, and services without attaching meaning to it. It was neither praised nor feared. Its presence did not provoke curiosity. This neutrality was its greatest change. What had once been burdened by significance, first strategic, then suspicious, now existed without narrative pressure. It had become ordinary again, though in a different way than before. History, observing this phase, revealed one of its quieter lessons. That resolution often comes not through correction, but through normalization. The question that had once demanded answers dissolved not because it was answered, but because it no longer organized decisions. The system had learned to live without explaining itself fully. Hemp no longer needed to be justified against its past. Its past no longer needed to be reconciled with the present. Both were allowed to coexist without alignment. This did not mean forgetting had ended. It meant forgetting had changed form. Instead of erasing memory, the system absorbed it indirectly, allowing past experience to inform present action without requiring acknowledgement. This is how large structures often evolve, not by remembering openly, but by adjusting behavior until memory becomes embedded in practice rather than preserved in story. The absence at the center of Hemp's story remained, but it no longer felt like a wound. Felt like space. Space for materials to be used without symbolism. Space for systems to adapt without apology. Space for history to remain present without demanding recognition. What had once been excluded was now included without ceremony, and what had once been defended was now unnecessary to defend. As this phase settled, the story approached its quiet conclusion. Not an ending marked by resolution or triumph, but by ease. The ease of a world that no longer needed to insist on why it had chosen one path over another. The ease of practices that worked because they were allowed to work. The ease of a material that had outlasted the narratives built around it and returned, not to prominence, but to usefulness. What remained was not a lesson carved into policy, but a rhythm restored to circulation. One in which materials, systems, and people moved together without demanding that history justify every step. And in that movement, hemp found its place not as an answer, but as part of a world that had learned, slowly and without announcement, how to live with what it once believed it had resolved forever.